We'll be starting in just a moment. We'll get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the National University Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Nancy Rowland Heinrich, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Vice President of Community Engagement for National University. I am very proud to be the founder and host of our NU Speaker Series. Since the inception of the Speaker Series in July 2020, we have held 60 episodes with a wonderful cast of presenters on a wide variety of subjects. Thank you to many of you who are rejoining us as past audience members. Please note that all of our past webinars have been recorded, and we will post a link in the chat. We really appreciate that all of you are joining us today, and in our audience, we welcome our current students, alumni, faculty, staff, and many community members who follow our series. National University prides itself on being in and of the community, and we appreciate our virtual audience joining us from throughout the country and abroad. Let me take a moment to share just a few things about National University. We were founded in 1971 by a retired U.S. Navy captain, Dr. David Chigos. In November, we will celebrate our 54th anniversary. And the university has had a very rich history of providing accessible and relevant higher education programs to meet the needs of non-traditional working and military students. Currently, almost 50% of our undergraduate students are military affiliated, and we're providing programs to more than 50,000 students a year who are enrolled in more than 125 degree programs, not only at the undergraduate and graduate level, but we now have more than 25 doctoral programs. NU has a very impressive alumni network with more than 250,000 graduates, including some very distinguished alumni, such as today's speaker. I extend a special welcome on behalf of our president, Dr. Mark Milliron, who wholeheartedly endorses our award-winning speaker series and joined us as moderator for the last 2 episodes. But now it's time to introduce today's topic and speaker. So regardless of what field you work in, today's topic should resonate with all of us as we explore blind descent with our speaker, Brian Dickinson, who will share his insight on overcoming adversity with courage and clarity. His story is very unique as he shares his experience of becoming snowblind while descending Mount Everest alone. Our audience will have an opportunity to listen to Brian's journey and lessons he learned in leadership, resiliency, and decision-making while under extreme pressure. Brian is a best-selling author due to his successful book, Blind Descent, which was released in 2014. You will hear his reflections today and how these lessons have shaped his journey and life, and important lessons that he wants to share with our audience. Brian also served 6 years in the U.S. Navy as a Special Operations Aviation Rescue swimmer, and he is described not only as an adventurous, but also a survivalist as he's navigated adversity and overcome many obstacles. Brian has also become a very well-known and popular motivational and keynote speaker, and we are so honored to have him join us today, especially as one of our notable National University alumni. We will hear from Brian in just a moment, but I'd also like to introduce today's moderator, Drew Schlosberg, who is a well-known podcaster and broadcaster. I'm very pleased to welcome Drew as our moderator today, as he has been affiliated with NU for more than 3 decades and has served as moderator for more than a dozen episodes for our NU speaker series. Drew's background includes 40 years experience in media, marketing, public relations, and the newspaper industry. Currently, he is a leading consultant for Cloudcast Media and produces several podcasts, including Spotlight on the Community, which is the longest running podcast in the country. He is a well-known figure in the San Diego community, active on several boards, and especially with a key role with Classroom of the Future Foundation. So audience, I hope you truly enjoyed today's presentation on blind descent. I'll turn it over to Drew for just a moment before we present our featured speaker, Brian Dickinson. Drew?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I appreciate that. I can't wait to hear this wonderful talk from Brian. I hope everybody in the audience has got their seatbelts strapped in over here. This is going to be a big e-ticket ride. And for those who don't know what I mean, go back to Disneyland. And so, Brian, looking forward to your chat.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on.
I think go ahead and ramp her up.
Gonna share here. All right. You looking good?
Looks great.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on. That was I can't live up to everything that you said, Nancy. So let's just kick it off with a video instead. So gets a little amped up there. So it was a compilation of my time on Everest over there in the Himalayas. But I always like to start with a little background just to kind of understand how I'm wired. Because we're all wired differently. So it's important to own that. So yeah, I spent 6 years in the US Navy. I was an aviation rescue swimmer, combat search and rescue, anti-submarine warfare, just all that fun stuff you do in your 20s. Did 2 tours or deployments to the Persian Gulf as a part of Operation Southern Watch, and just some amazing, worked with some amazing people, did some amazing things that you just don't see in normal life. So it's good and bad, it's layers of trauma, dealing with trauma. And over time, I feel like I've just been chasing this trauma from childhood to present. But I'm pretty healthy at the moment. So 6 years, back then, back in the 90s, we didn't have, like, thank goodness, cell phones and all the stuff we have today in social media. So here's basically 6 years in 60 seconds with 90s quality video. All right. Yeah. So what do? You go from jumping from helicopters, having that just fun, active lifestyle to, finish my degree at National University and then get my MBA and moved to the Pacific Northwest, was working in the high-tech industry like Expedia when I was part of Microsoft and Cisco Systems, and doing well, but still there's just that adventure gap that can occur if you're wired a certain way. So naturally, I started climbing and decided to climb the highest peaks on the seven continents. This one in particular is in Antarctica in 2011. It was -70 on top, so a little chilly. I'm like sitting on my backpack so I don't stick to the ground. But what an experience. So that leads me in to Everest. So Mount Everest stands at 29,035 feet. So the highest peak in the world. It's up there in the jet stream where major jet airliners cruise at. There's only a third of the air, third of the ozone up there. In fact, above 26,000 feet, they call it the death zone. If you cut your finger, it won't heal. So why do it, right? It's kind of dumb. I've been called worse. But it's a lifestyle, and it's just like anything. Every person that's listening right now, everyone that's here has something that someone probably calls you crazy for doing, but it's who you are, and it doesn't seem crazy to you. So the closer you get to, solving certain problems in your life, like mountaineering, things become very real and very attainable. So that's all I'll say about that. Um, but one thing I would say is I was climbing the highest peaks on the seven continents, and I'm very goal oriented, and I'll do everything, reverse engineer it to get the training and technical skills, the financial. I have a family, so dealing just kind of all that, balancing it all out, making sure I'm prioritizing things accordingly. But a lot of times, we get so focused, even in a degree, right? You want that degree, that piece of paper, but it truly is that journey. So in Everest, just going to the mountain itself is so amazing because you're spending 2 months over there. You're immersed with Sherpa and just seeing these just amazing places. And it truly is, you just got to stop and look around and really enjoy that journey, because all those steps moving forward are really what gets you to the top. It's the same with education, right? You don't get there without taking all the classes and all the heartbreak and everything else that goes into it, but it's certainly rewarding, and in the end, you earned it. So, like I mentioned, the Sherpa are the local people over here in Nepal and Tibet. I climbed on the Nepalese side, and just super strong, amazing people. This dude definitely has something on his mind, but just great people. I have a lot of great Sherpa friends. And here's my team, sort of team. I went independent, so I didn't climb with an actual team, but I had some Sherpa support down in lower areas, like a cook at base camp and some porters going in from where we flew in. And most people may not realize, just to get to base camp, and base camp is at 17,500 feet, it's 38 miles on foot. So you're carrying all your gear, and it takes a week and a half to 2 weeks because you're acclimating, because you're getting up at altitude. But my buddy there on the left is Pasang Sherpa. I'll be talking about him a little bit as we go. And since we're not in I mean, there's probably like a raise hands thing here. Always curious, like who would ever want to climb Everest? Like if I'm live, some people put their hands up. A lot of people will say, heck no. Well, today we all get to climb it. So sit back, here we go. So we're here at 17,500 feet. We're at base camp. The first major obstacle, and arguably the most dangerous area of the mountain, is the Khumbu Icefall. It is a river of flowing ice, building-sized blocks of ice called seracs. And this is where you see a lot of those aluminum ladders going across crevasses. So you get through this, get up to Camp 1, which is just under 20,000 feet, and then move through the western Khum. Khum is a valley, so this is probably the safest area, except for this one spot that I'll show you later, and get up to Camp 2. Camp 2 is advanced base camp, so that's where we have like another cooking tent, and very exposed. Like our tents would get shredded sometimes. We'd have to collapse them. And then out of there, you start moving up to Camp 3, and you actually climb up Lhotse. Lhotse face is this just straight up rock and ice. You camp anchored off at Camp 3, and Lhotse is the fourth highest mountain in the world. You actually climb up Lhotse just to get to High Camp, the South Col, which is the highest camp in the world. This is where the death zone begins at 26,000 feet. And then if you have a clear weather window, you go for the summit, and you climb through the night, just because once the sun comes out, things become very unstable, and just slowly move up, get to the halfway point here at the balcony, 27,500 feet, up the rock step, and the humiliating south summit, because it's a false summit. You get up there and you got to drop back down, go across this sketchy area here, up Hillary Step, and then you can finally see the true summit of Mount Everest. And you pierce your crampons on the top and look around and check it out. You guys all made it. Congrats. If it was only that easy. So this is my view from my tent in base camp. So it's a crazy, like the Khumbu Icefall, it's legit. Like you climb through the night, like I'd mentioned, because when that sun comes up, things become super unstable. So like the anchor points that fix lines, which are ropes attached that, Sherpa and guides attached to the mountain, are, the anchor points are made of metal. So that's a conductor of heat, and they can come loose. And so then I would climb through, like wake up at 3 a.m., climb through as fast as I can, and sometimes just touch Camp 1 and come all the way back down. And what you're doing is you are acclimating. So if you took yourself at sea level, which most of us are at, put yourself on the summit, you'd pass out and die. It's kind of like if you're in an airplane and it gets depressurized, everyone passes out and you crash. Same in the mountains. So how to work against that is You climb high and sleep low. That forces your body into oxygen-deprived areas, which then your body will produce more red blood cells, which carry oxygen. So it's a timely process. It takes about a month on the mountain to acclimate. So you just go up and down, up and down. And here's one of those ladders, just the cheapest aluminum ladders, and we'll have them tied together. And you get pretty good at crossing those, but you never want to get complacent because people do have fallen in, and it's pretty much game over. That's kind of what it's like. This picture was taken on, actually, I set my camera up and took it of myself. This was Easter Sunday of 2011. I'm at Camp 1 by myself. That's just under 20,000 feet. You can see the summit of Everest is way behind me. It's still 2 vertical miles above me. So it's definitely a big mountain. So going through the Western Cone to get to Camp 2 or Advanced Base Camp, remember I said that it was the safest area, except for this section. These 5 ladders tied together. When you step on that, it drops about 3 feet and swings. It's definitely an interesting experience. There is a 15-minute walk around. It's still sketchy to go to your left out and around. But I went on this a couple times, mainly to experience it for one, and to get a picture for my wife. And she's definitely scared of heights, so she was not impressed. So from there, you move into Advanced Base Camp, and then you start the real climbing up Lhotse Face. Like I mentioned, it's the 4th highest mountain in the world. You actually climb straight up that, just slowly, slowly, just one slow step in front of the other. And it is straight up. So if you can tell what this is, there's climbers coming up through the center there. So if you slip and fall, if you come off rope, which you never should, you're going to accelerate. You're not going to stop. And at Camp 3, this is where the tents are kind of anchored into the side wall. This is where most climbers start using supplemental oxygen. And supplemental, it's not like scuba where it's 100% compressed air. It's just where it mixes with the outside air, kind of like World War II pilots. Because if you came off scuba, you would pass out and die. So it's definitely extra weight. But I woke up and everything was like bulletproof ice solid around me except for me. So I figured it was working. So I'm going to jump straight to my summit push here. So this would have been after a month on the mountain going up and down. I'd already climbed 2 20,000 foot peaks out in the Himalayas to help in my acclimatization process. But on May 14th, 2011, started moving up, just myself and Pasong. He's my Sherpa friend. And we were met by 70-mile-an-hour winds. And it was like every step forward was like 2 back. And just going straight up, just slowly, slowly inching our way up higher and higher. And the people that you see there are actually descending, they're coming down. A couple people did summit that night, which would have been just miserable. A famous Japanese climber passed out, or he died, he passed away on the South Summit. Most people turned back. But this is a pivotal point in my story. So I got about 1,000 feet above Camp 3, and I stopped to get some water. And I anchored off to one of the anchor points, a metal screw that screws into the ice. So I was safe, but my foot slipped out, and I had my goggles around my wrist because I had to take my mask off, everything, so I could drink. My response was to grab that rope. And even though I was anchored, it's just an unnatural place that I was at. And my goggles slid off my arm and they fell down the mountain. And at that point, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to have to either go try to find them, which would be impossible, or it's over because you don't bring extra gear like that on the mountain. But miracle or not, some Sherpa down below, about 500 feet below, waved at me. They had the goggles went to them, like it slid over to them, and they tied them around the rope, and they weren't coming up to me. So I came off oxygen, anchored my pack down, rappelled down, got to my goggles. And when I did, I noticed they were cracked. So goggles have two lenses. The internal lens was cracked. And most people that have been in the cold know that like goggles will freeze or glasses will fog up or freeze because of the cold outside, the contrast to that, to your warm breath. Mine were freezing between layers. So I continued moving up.
Can't see a thing in these goggles, they're all fogged up.
You can see that ice there is just bulletproof. But yeah, I was documenting my madness while I was there. You can see the selfie I took. There's a crack there. I ended up ripping that internal lens out just because I couldn't see, not really realizing it would cut their effectiveness in half. So continued moving up. And if you look here, this is the South Summit. You can't even see the true summit yet until you're like on it. That 70-mile-an-hour gust just kicking off the top. I don't know if you can see down to your right. Like I can't really see it on mine, but there's a couple dots there. Those are actually climbers. So it just kind of gives you perspective to just how big the mountain is. So in the early afternoon, I made it into the highest camp in the world. You can see some tents are shredded, some stacks of oxygen, and found Pasong, let him know about my goggles. And, we just kind of like laid back and rested. We made a radio call to see how the weather was going to be for that night and the next day to make a summit push. And it was going to clear up, and we looked outside and it was. And that's kind of how Everest rolls, just because it's so high up there in the jet stream. Like you'll have some crazy weather during the day, but through the night, it's pretty calm. So we decided to make our summit attempt. And I don't think we realized at the time we're the only two people on either side, no one on Tibet, just two of us on Nepal going up. Everyone else was waiting for the next day, just this other weather window, because there's only a few days that you can climb each year. So very unique experience. But we put our gear together and, just crampons on and everything that we needed, a couple extra oxygen bottles, and went outside and watched the sunset from the highest camp in the world, which is pretty surreal. And as soon as the sun went down, we started moving up. And this is the last slide that I'll show for a while because it's all nighttime. But we moved out of high camp at 26,000 feet, and we're just slowly moving up, just switchbacks through the rock and ice. And it's pretty steep. I started edging away from Pasang, and we had a rendezvous point at the halfway point, which would be 27,500 feet. I got up there pretty efficiently, and I waited for an hour, and I could see Pasang with his headlamp way down below. And he eventually showed up and just said he wasn't feeling well. So at that point, I thought, okay, well then we need to go down. We had a conversation. He's like, no, I ran out of water. So I gave him a spare water, and he vomited. So I said, Pasang, we need to go down. He assured me, no, I'm okay. We can make this. And in mountaineering, you live and die by the decisions you make, but you make the decisions based on the information you have, and you trust those that you're with. So it's one of those rules. Pasang was a early 20s, young guy, had a couple summits already. So we continued up and made it to 28,000 feet. And this is where it starts getting more technical climbing. And that's when he said, I'm out. In fact, he said he was going to go back to the balcony, which was right close to where we were at. And he said, you should go up. And he left an extra oxygen bottle. But at that point, I said, I had to make a major decision because I'd be the only one climbing. Look at things like how was the weather? The weather was good. How was I? I felt strong. But most importantly, how was Pasang? Could my friend get down? And he assured me he could. He was going to wait right there. And he just turned around and started moving. And I did the same. I didn't know at the time, but he ended up going all the way down to high camp, which he needed to do. It's survival up there. So I start climbing, and it's not like overly technical at like sea level, but at 28,000 feet, way up there in the death zone, it's a lot because you have the spikes on your boots and just all this gear and oxygen, and just trying to rock climb at that level. It's pretty gnarly. Um, but then I made it close to the top of that section. I looked out to my left and I saw this.
Artillery step. That's the summit.
And then my camera froze. But what you're looking at there is the sun rising from the highest peak in the world, casting that perfect pyramid shadow down over the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world. So it was just such a amazing moment to capture for one, but just to be there, and it's a place I can go back to in my life. But the sun is a major motivator in mountaineering. You're climbing through the night. You have a headlamp on, and you're just one step in front of the other. Very monotonous, and you don't really have an indication of time until that sun rises. And you always try to target getting close to the summit or on the summit when the sun is rising. So it's a major motivator. Little vitamin D probably didn't hurt either. So got over the south summit. The first section after the south summit is this area they call the Cornice Traverse. It is about 2 feet wide and it is literally a 2-mile drop on your left into Nepal and a 2-mile drop on your right into Tibet. So you have options. So slowly made my way across that. Got to Hillary Step, which is a 40-foot rock climb. Usually a point of contention because you've seen the lines on Everest before. Well, there's only a few days you can summit. So then there's one way up, one way down. So you got to wait. I had nobody. So I bounced over that. And you can actually see my footsteps right there on this cornice area here. Below is Lhotse. That's the mountain I climbed up just to get to the high camp. 4th highest mountain in the world. That's Makalu. Out to the left is the 5th highest mountain in the world. And Nuptse, which is down in the western Coombe area, just kind of bordering it. So it's surreal to be so high in the air that all the highest mountains in the world are below you. And then just taking those last few steps it's impossible to process in the moment. But I ended up reaching the summit of Mount Everest. And according to the Himalayan database, I'm one of 2 to have ever had it to myself on a given day. And I didn't intend to do that. It's just how it worked out. But I just feel very blessed to have had that. And I remember just sitting there and taking pictures and just trying to process the moment. And it's hard when you're alone. Like if there's people around, you can like high five or something. I don't know what you do, fist bump. But I pulled out my radio and made a radio call down, and just everyone that was monitoring the frequencies, all the different camps, all I said was, "This is Brian checking in from the summit of Everest." And just everyone came to life. They're just, super pumped. Congratulations. And I had a friend who was at Camp 3 who was heading up to the South Col that night. He hops on and says, congrats. He's like, just, make sure that you and Pasang give a radio call once you're down lower. And it was at that moment I realized no one knew I was alone. So I said, well, that's cool, but Pasang went down over an hour ago. And he's like, you're alone? And he's like, yeah. He's like, well, be careful. So I hung up, or I put down the radio, and he, at that point, turned to Lakba Sherpa, who he was climbing with, who's had 5 summits and I'd been climbing with for the last month. He asked him, how long is it going to take Brian to get down to high camp? He says, like, Brian, it'll take him 2 to 3 hours. And then no one would hear from me for 7 hours. So the thing with mountaineering is the top is halfway there. you got to get down. You can't spend a lot of time enjoying the summit. And I knew that. So spending less than an hour, got all my pictures, tried to take it in as much as I could. I needed to head down. So I started moving down, and about 10, 15 feet into it, everything just went completely white. And I went snowblind. And I remember dropping to my knees at that point, grabbing the fixed line, the rope that I was attached to, and assessing the situation. I remember thinking, I'm at the highest point in the world. I'm completely alone, and I'm blind, and I need to get down. No one's coming to get me. And without overthinking it, I got up and I started moving. Just slowly, slowly, one step, one deliberate step at a time. And I'm not normally blind. I tried so hard to use my eyes, they just would not work. And snow blindness is the sunburning of the cornea. And once it happens, it's done. It usually takes 24 hours to return. I wouldn't regain my eyesight for a month and a half. And instead of like blind where everything's black, it is bright white. If you put a light bulb right in front of your face and you move your finger, you'll know something moved. You saw like a shadow, but you cannot focus on it. And it feels like if you had potato chips in your eyelids, realize how often they flutter. I don't recommend it. But I just started moving, not panicking, not overthinking. You know, I was trained for this in the military to never panic. Panic kills. And I just started moving. And one step in front of the other. And this is what I was coming down. That's a quarter of it. That's another quarter. And the first major obstacle was Hillary Step. I remember getting to the top of that and reversing my gear and trying to rappel down. I slipped out and pendulumed, hit the rock, and just kind of slid down the rock surface. And I remember laying on this little shelf of snow and ice and assessing, am I broken? Like, no, I think I'm okay. So I just kind of laid there, got some water, and then started moving again. I could feel 50-mile-an-hour gusts of wind coming up over the ridge at this point. I would hear it using my other senses. And I had to go across that Cornice Traverse, that 2-mile drop on each side. And I remember I would hear the gust and I would hunker down. It'd blow over me. I'd get up, take one more step. And it took so long. But this entire journey, I never once felt alone. I just felt this peaceful presence around me. It's like if you're in the room with someone else and you close your eyes, they don't say anything, but you know they're there. I didn't know how to explain it. In fact, I didn't even think too much about it. It's just like I was with somebody. So I got across that traverse. I got to the south summit, had to climb back up that. And then on the other side, I took a step and gained purchase. And then the next step, I just slipped out. And it was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It's like go to your roof, close your eyes, and jump off. It's so helpful, just helpless. And I'm upside down, my oxygen bottle's coming out of my pack, and I just had to right myself and lower my heart rate. And then I side traversed over to where Pasong had left. That's where I ended up. And I almost walked right past that oxygen bottle, but it was like this bright orange thing. And I remember laying down next to it, fumbling with my regulator, and it just wouldn't work. I tried for a while, but I didn't have all day to troubleshoot. So I put my working oxygen back on. And I don't know why to this day, but I put that extra 15 pounds, that other non-functioning bottle in my pack. And I started moving. I eventually got to the balcony, 27,500 feet, where Pasong said he was going to be, and he wasn't. I had assumed he went down. And I remember feeling happy at this moment. I'm like, I made it through this technical area. Now it's just 20 pitches of rappel. Like I can do this. And I started rappelling down, and 20 feet into it, my mask just sucks into my face. And I remember ripping it off. I ran out of oxygen. So at this point, I'd been climbing for 33 hours from the day prior to this point, completely blind and just the worst scenario. No one survives this. And at that moment, I couldn't do it on my own anymore. I dropped to my knees and just prayed. And around the world at that exact moment, there's accounts of like my wife, my good friends, people I didn't even know that knew I was climbing, just feeling an urge to pray for me at that time. And I just simply said, God, I cannot do this alone. Please help me. And immediately I felt this energy come over me. It was like someone lifted me up. And I just remember not overthinking it, just trying that other oxygen bottle again, and I got a positive flow. And I remember taking 5 deep breaths, and it was like fire entering my veins. I could feel it course through my entire body. It was painful, but I had life. And I started rappelling down, not overthinking this new life that I have, and got about the last quarter mile into high camp. Never saw him coming. In fact, at one point, I was wondering, did I die? Like, am I dead right now? And then out of nowhere, Pasang just hugs me. He's like, Brian, you alive? And this is a picture that my friend took from high camp as he was entering high camp. And I don't know if you can tell, I'm coming down. I can't even see Pasang at that point, but he's meeting me. And yeah, it was amazing just to have that human contact. That's the first moment I knew I was alive. And he helped me get back to the high camp, our tent. I threw him my camera. He's checking out my summit pics, and I just passed out for about 15 hours. My eyes were glued shut. I'd lost 20 pounds. Um, I'd keep ripping my eyes open. And yeah, it was pretty miserable, but I still had to get down the mountain. So the next day, my other friend and Pasang were heading down together, and just nothing glamorous about it, just tripping over rocks and making my way down. And eventually got to advanced base camp at Camp 2, which is the first time I was able to call my wife. And I had a French Canadian friend who had a sat phone. I had her dial her number. And she already heard that I had summited. And I said, "Hun, just stop. There was a delay." So I'm like, I soloed the mountain and I'm blind. And then the phone cut out. So I probably own the highest selfie in the world, solo selfie, and definitely the worst phone call to spouse. Don't ever try to win that one from me. But the next day we were able to get down. I was going across ladders, crawling, and got down to base camp where I was able to talk to my wife, Joanna. And I've had, this is 14 years ago. And as soon as I got back, I hadn't even started to deal with the trauma of it all, of a near-death experience. And I've quickly found out people love a survival story, but they don't necessarily think about the survivor and what they're going through and just how hard that is. The news channels, everything, bright lights at my house and all this craziness. And I've had this time to try to understand, why am I alive? There's 300 bodies on that mountain. Like, there's nothing special about me. Why am I here? And I truly feel it comes down to two things for me: faith and focus. Focus is ironic because I couldn't see a thing, but I knew what I needed to do to survive. I had to find a reason to take one more step forward and then one more step forward. I knew I was no one survives that. Like 100%, I'm not going to survive. As soon as you start thinking that, you're already dead. So I kept moving forward. And then I reached a point, and I think we all reach this point in our life where we're trying so hard to do it on our own and we're unwilling to ask for help. And I reached that point when I ran out of oxygen and I asked for help and I witnessed a miracle. And I'm just grateful to be here. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know how I can say any more than wow. That's a heck of a story there, Brian. And before we get to some of the questions in the Q&A, I got one for you. So you already had calm and the chaos in your DNA due to your Navy ops experience, correct? After this Mount Everest experience, did that enhance your calm and your chaos MO? What did it do to you? Or did it do anything to you?
Yeah, yeah. There's a pre-Everest and a post version of me. I think anyone who climbs the mountain, you have that. Mine's unique to me and is very extreme. And the the ability to remain calm in chaotic situations. I'm not perfect. I'm as flawed as anyone. Um, but that is the reason I wrote that other book. And my wife is a counselor, and she co-wrote with me just because she's a little softer. I'm kind of straight to the point. Um, but that's the question I get asked the most is how didn't I panic up there? And that my job in the military was to never panic. That's why there's such a high attrition rate. We are working in oxygen deprived areas. They're trying to drown us every day because we're jumping from a helicopter in the middle of the ocean to rescue someone who's potentially trying to kill us. So we have to remain calm, get control of them, and get them hoisted up 80 feet in the air. So I don't know if it I know the version of me. Uh, I don't know what I was prior, but I became so much more introverted after my experience on Everest. And now I'm kind of this, maybe you call me a shy extrovert because once I trust you and I can get outside of my bubble and then I can be me. But I don't know. I think anytime you have a survival situation, I've met quite a bit and friends with like Marcus Luttrell and others, and it's you feel very isolated because no one else can relate.
All right, here's a question from the audience. How did you even begin to train for this? Obviously, you're in great shape with your work with the Navy ops, but isn't that a different type of training?
It is, and it's super important. And a lot of people reach out to me because, you see Everest and it's like, oh, I want to go do that. It's like there's a lot of cool adventures in this world. There's a lot of cool mountains and mountain ranges. Like going after Everest, it's kind of that pinnacle peak, but Mount Rainier is in my backyard. So I've been training out here. I grew up in the mountains, but I did Denali and Mount Elbrus in Russia and Kilimanjaro and like some of these other peaks prior. But it's what I'll tell people is you need to be able to be on the sharp end of that rope, meaning you're guiding to be able to climb Everest on its best day because things rarely go, things usually go sideways and you have to be, you train for the things within your control, but you have to be able to respond to the things outside your control. And if you don't train properly for all that, then you're putting yourself and others at risk.
Yeah, there's no question about it. All right, so here you are. When did you decide you're going to do this challenge? I mean, you're doing all your Navy ops stuff. You're in some very dangerous, treacherous waters, no pun intended. And are you under water and you go, I think I need to climb Everest? I mean, when did you make that decision?
No, I was out. I got out in officially in 99 and
Right.
finished my degrees and was working the high tech. You go from jump from a helicopter to sitting behind a desk. It's a tough transition. I talked to a lot of veterans, no matter what you did in the military, if you're going to jump on a grenade one day and the next day you're whatever, it's a tough transition because there's nothing like it. For me, it was the closest thing to military. I mean, it's the camaraderie, the challenge, the physical challenge and emotional, spiritual everything, the gear, like you're putting your life on the line. What I didn't realize until just, I think since I wrote Calm in the Chaos, is I had been chasing trauma my entire life. I didn't grow up in a healthy situation, dealing with all kinds of abuse and jumping into being a rescue swimmer. And even then, during rescue swimmer school, one of the toughest schools, my grandpa, who was my father figure, shot himself. So I had to take emergency leave. And it's just trauma after trauma. And, you see that a lot. You see a lot of people get out and then they go into first responders and they're comfortable, being uncomfortable. And high altitude mountaineering was just another avenue of that. And even though I'm good at that stuff, it's not good for me because the body keeps score and it accumulates. And eventually you got to figure that out. And I'm a lot healthier than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So now that you've had this experience, and it was a while ago, of course, but it probably seems like in some ways it was yesterday, right?
Mhm.
Has your attitude changed about taking on challenges like this? Or, know what, I'm going to do, there's one more challenge. I need to sit there and fly to the space station mirror, or whatever the case may be, you know?
Yeah, no, that'd be cool. There's so I'm 50 plus now, and I think as we get older, if we try to remain the age that we were, that's not realistic, but adventure still exists. It just looks different. Having kids, and I had kids during they were young when I was doing the Seven Summits, but keeping them involved. Like they climbed to the highest peak in Australia with me to finish it off when they were like, I don't know, 6 and 8.
Well,
So they have a pretty healthy portfolio, but within reason. I'm not the type that's just going to push them so far out of their comfort zone, but I'm also not the type that's going to like have these tight little boundaries that they never know what they're truly capable of doing. But I also want them to be who they are, not who I am.
yeah. Have you lost any close friends to mountaineering?
Yeah, I've lost both in the military and mountaineering.
Yeah, yeah. How has that played on your psyche when it comes to taking on challenges like this?
Yeah, it's if you're not there, it's hard to comment. And that's kind of my thing because I have been there.
Right,
So everyone's brave behind a keyboard. And that's the people that I've lost, they loved what they're doing and they
right.
would rather go out no other way. In fact, my best friend just passed away a few months, earlier this year, from a brain tumor, but it never stopped him. He'd still get out and just living his life to the fullest and, no regrets when it comes down to it. And he's modeling that behavior to others. Whereas, some people they play it safe their whole life and that's fine. That's who they are. But some of us are a little bit different.
Right. Here's another question from the audience. Based on all your life experiences, if you walked into a classroom full of kids, and you can choose what grade level that'll be, and you were asked to teach them just one lesson, what would that be?
Oh, I would think being your believing in yourself is a lesson. I think we have so many voices that we hear that are not our own voices. They're put into our brain from whether it's your parents or other people that are just not you. No one's in our own head, as much as we are. We know what we are, but if you listen to those voices, it'll just anchor you down. You can be paralyzed and not have, positive growth in your life. So I don't know what lesson that is, but it's kind of like advocating for yourself. Don't let others tell you what you can and can't do.
That's a pretty good lesson. It's a pretty good learning in this area. So you've are you still climbing and maybe not climbing Everest? And if not, what are you doing to satisfy your adrenaline? Obviously you're pretty high powered, as you mentioned. You are getting a little bit older. Is there anything that is on the horizon for you? I need to do X.
Yeah, I still climb, but you're not at the capacity. I have all just from the Navy itself. I have so many like back and knee and just all kinds of injuries and even dealing with trauma from that. But I still definitely get out. Nature therapy is so important, and whatever that means to the individual, just walking across the street or serving others or whatever, but just getting outside. Like if we get in our own head, things can get very dangerous. So that's important to me. But yeah, my wife and I just became empty nesters, so there's a whole, another level of depression that nothing prepares you for. We miss the
Right, or in
kids.
some cases the other way around, but I get
Yeah.
that. Absolutely. So, I heard you have this new near-death experience a while ago. Has that changed you about how you take on challenges like this?
I've always calculate my risks. I think I learned that early on in my life, from getting injured or doing stupid things as a kid. But in the military, I mean, you're always calculating. In the end, you have a choice to jump from that helicopter or not. And I don't know anyone who hasn't jumped, but it's like you still have that choice, and it's still a part of the mindset going into it. But yeah, anytime you have these life experiences, if it doesn't change you one way or the other, then that's a shame. And I think that's very risky. So even in mountaineering, like if someone says they're fearless, I'm not going to have them on my rope team because you have no gauge. You can't calculate good versus bad, and you're going to put us all at risk. Like fear, it's what you do with that fear is what keeps us alive.
Yeah. So we're going to turn it back over to Nancy Rowland, who will wrap up here. And Brian, are you available to take a few more questions after Nancy wraps up?
Sure. Yep. I got a few minutes.
Nancy, it's all yours.
Well, I think we're all pretty awestruck after hearing your story. I mean, Brian, that was just so compelling to have you. The videos added a lot so we could see your destination and where you were going. But your experience, I would think that every time you share that, you're just reliving it. And I think we could all feel a lot of fear and anxiety and hope as, you walk through your story. So thank you so much for doing that and for answering the questions. I know that everyone on the call is probably very interested in, looking at your book and, taking a deeper dive into your journey and what you went through. And you are wired very differently from most of the rest of us, I would say, because the chat comments were definitely that could not do this. And I know I personally, I'm afraid of heights. I'd be more like your wife and just scared to death to even think about the experience. But a lot of admiration from everybody who listened to your journey. And I know we'll have a lot of people that listen to this later. So encourage you, get a copy of Brian's book. I loved your analogy in the beginning with, education, but that is not as challenging and near death experience as what you went through, but I'm sure that it shapes you, and good for you that your children are, maybe not following in your exact footsteps, but definitely willing to take some of those challenges. But at this time, just in honor of everyone's time, I want to just share, we've got upcoming Alumni Association meeting later this week, Military Community Power Hour. You're welcome to join us for that. Navigator Network at the end of the month on the 27th. We do host a on-site career transition seminar with Trevor Blair. That'll be on the 30th. And then our Alumni Association is hosting a virtual Halloween party. I believe this will be the 5th year. So that will be a lot of fun for those who wish to participate. And then we will be having a speaker series next month, and we'll be sending out the information on that. You can look at any of the prior speaker series. I don't think we've ever had one quite this intense and where we could really feel that moment, but lots of different topic is if anyone is interested. But let's go ahead and see if there's any last questions that people want to ask. Drew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Nancy, so much. I'm going to ask one before we get to a couple of other questions here, Brian. So you've written two or three books. Is it two?
Three.
Three, right. So here you are, and anybody who has written a book knows that that is a pretty tough experience to do this. You got to have thick skin and all that business and persistent. Talk about how your book writing experience was.
Yeah. I've never considered myself, never thought I would write a book. But I got back and the the media was all over it. They wanted to make my story into a movie, and I wasn't ready for that. I didn't like the direction of that. So I talked to Tyndale House and my agent and said I'll write the book. and then we'll go from there. But yeah, it's a process, and you rewrite a book like 5 times before you're done. And then, yeah, once you put it out there, it's like the ultimate form of vulnerability because, there's what, 8 billion people or however many on this earth, and there's one of us. And, it's an interesting process, not to deter anyone from doing it, but it's a lot of work.
No, we talk about this authors quite a bit on the speaker series and so forth. Here's another question from our audience. Person works with veterans that have been diagnosed with PTSD, and this person is also a veteran with it. What is something you would share with veterans like yourself who continue in the trauma chasing cycle, using that person's words?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your service. And I'm sorry that you're dealing with that. It's for people that haven't dealt with like the panic attacks and just the intrusive thoughts and just everything that goes along with PTSD. It's it's legit. It's so scary. And I'm there. Um, Awareness is so important. The fact that you can, name it to tame it, but, at least name it so you're aware and understanding when those triggers are happening and what to do, getting the tools. Medication is okay. It's not about being a zombie. It's about finding what works for you. I know I had to, and I am, and I've went from high extremes to low extremes on it. And it's I don't know, kind of like the mountain. I knew what I needed to do to get down the mountain to stay alive. If the mountain was going to take me, it was going to take me. I was going to do everything I could to stay alive. And I feel like that is every single day for the veterans and those that are dealing with PTSD, finding that reason, and there is reason. I heard on a podcast recently and I liked it, so I'm just going to own it. I won't give credit. I'll just take it and it's mine now. No, it's Jay Shetty. It, Everything hard that we've ever went through, we have survived 100% of those things that we didn't think we could get through. So when we're going through something right now and it's our worst day, 100%, you can get through it.
Yeah, here's a final question here. Through your military career and through your Everest expedition, and I know I'm going to add to it your book writing expedition as well. Um, what do you think applies the most to everyday challenges, whether it's in leadership, family, or personal growth, based on all of your experiences?
I think, honestly, it's showing up. I think there's across all of it is just being present is so important. And I feel like there's such a lack of continuity or consistency anymore. So it's just from a leadership standpoint, making you're gonna make bad choices, and that's just a part of life. But the worst choice is no choice. The worst decision is no decision. So I think just being present, showing up, making decisions, and I don't know, just being open to that feedback, because when you do screw up and you know people will call you out, and I think when you're sitting there making excuses, it's obvious. Just own it. Like, I'm my bad. I'm learning. I'm human. We're all flawed.
No, I think that's a good point. Well, Brian, what an absolute pleasure to hear your story. Thanks for sharing this, and we're going to look forward to diving into your books. And Nancy, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you for taking those few extra questions. I think everybody learned a lot from you, and I know that it must be very challenging to keep reliving that experience, but your willingness to share your story and narrate that to us was just a really meaningful and significant opportunity for all of us to learn through you. And I admire your wife for, being
Me
there,
too.
and that must have taken a lot. And I'm sure as a father, a lot of your background and things has really shaped your parenting. And love to see, even though you're empty nester now, what directions the kids go. But National University works so much with military, and we have a lot of people in special forces and things. And I know our community from the day I started here, which was 46 years tomorrow.
Wow.
And I was hired by the founder, and there was just such a great respect for our military community and the type of people that it takes with the bravery and the courage to be able to place yourself in, harm's way at times. And a mountain is placing yourself in that way as well. So just really admire your story, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. Appreciate Lindsay and Tara and Heather for helping with the NU Speaker Series. And this is why we offer it, because these are the kinds of stories and the people that you get a chance to meet that you wouldn't otherwise have. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Drew. And thank you, everyone who's still with us. Good evening.
Thanks.